Hello, my friend. If you've ever said, I'm doing keto, but I'm not in ketosis, this video is for you. Ketosis is not a diet trend. Ketosis is a metabolic state. And when you reach it, your body switches from burning sugar to burning fat. That's when brain fog lifts, hunger calms down, energy becomes steady, and fat loss finally makes sense. Today, I'm going to walk you through the three fastest, safest, science backed ways to get into ketosis without starving, without guessing, and without wrecking your metabolism. For decades, you were told the problem was willpower, that if you were hungry, tired, overweight, foggy, inflamed, or stuck, it was because you weren't disciplined enough. But the truth is far more unsettling and far more freeing because your body is not broken. It is responding exactly as biology demands when insulin is constantly elevated. And insulin, not calories, not motivation, not moral strength, is the master switch that decides whether your body stores fat or burns it. Every time carbohydrates enter your bloodstream, they are rapidly converted into glucose. And glucose triggers insulin, a powerful storage hormone whose single job is to move sugar out of the blood and lock energy away for later. And as long as insulin stays high, fat burning is biologically impossible, not difficult, not delayed, but chemically blocked at the cellular level. This is not opinion. It is physiology, proven repeatedly in metabolic ward studies where subjects eating identical calories burned radically different amounts of fat depending solely on insulin exposure. And when insulin stays elevated day after day, meal after meal, snack after snack, your body becomes trapped in a state of permanent storage, unable to access its own fat reserves even while starving for energy. This is why people feel exhausted while gaining weight, why hunger feels uncontrollable, why cravings scream louder the harder you resist, because insulin does not ask for permission, it issues commands. And when insulin is high, fat cells close their doors, locking away energy that the rest of the body desperately needs. The brain feels this energy shortage first, and it responds by demanding quick fuel, sugar, starch, anything that raises glucose fast, creating a feedback loop that feels like addiction, but is actually survival chemistry misfiring in a modern food environment. Studies show that high insulin states reduce fatty acid release by more than 50%, meaning even someone carrying excess body fat can be metabolically starving, unable to tap into the very fuel they are told they should burn. This is why calorie restriction alone so often fails, because cutting calories while insulin remains high simply slows metabolism, increases hunger hormones, and teaches the body to conserve energy, not release it. When carbohydrates are sharply reduced, something remarkable happens at a molecular level. Insulin falls, sometimes within hours, and the biochemical locks on fat cells begin to open, allowing stored fat to be released into the bloodstream as free fatty acids, which the liver then converts into ketones, an ancient fuel source that powered human survival long before agriculture existed. Ketones are not just fuel, they are signaling molecules that reduce inflammation, stabilize brain energy, and improve mitochondrial efficiency. And research shows that when insulin drops and ketones rise, hunger hormones like ghrelin decrease while satiety hormones increase, meaning the body naturally eats less without force or suffering. This is why ketosis feels different from dieting, because it is not about fighting the body. It is about removing the signal that keeps fat locked away. Anthropological evidence reveals that humans evolved in long stretches of low carbohydrate availability, cycling between feast and scarcity. And during those times, insulin was low, ketones were high, and the brain thrived on fat-derived fuel. Yet in modern society, insulin is elevated from morning to night, not because of overeating alone, but because carbohydrates now dominate every meal, every snack, every processed food marketed as healthy. Even foods labeled whole grain or low fat can spike insulin enough to block fat burning for hours. And when eaten repeatedly throughout the day, insulin never returns to baseline, creating a metabolic traffic jam that no amount of exercise can override. Research has shown that even trained athletes cannot oxidize fat efficiently in a high insulin state, proving that fitness does not override hormones. Biology always wins. When carbohydrates are reduced below a critical threshold, usually around 20 to 30 grams per day, insulin falls low enough for the liver to shift into ketone production, and this transition is not dangerous. It is deeply familiar to human metabolism, observed in newborns, fasting adults, and populations consuming traditional low-carb diets without chronic disease. The discomfort some feel during this transition is not evidence of harm, but evidence of withdrawal, as the body relearns how to burn fat after years or decades of sugar dependence. And studies show this adaptation period corresponds with shifts in enzyme activity, mitochondrial function, and electrolyte balance, not tissue damage or metabolic failure. What makes this shift powerful is not deprivation, but liberation. Because once insulin is no longer dominating the system, the body gains metabolic flexibility, the ability to switch between fuels seamlessly, something strongly associated with longevity, cognitive resilience, and metabolic health in scientific literature. Insulin resistance, driven largely by chronic carbohydrate exposure, is now linked to obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, and even certain cancers, and yet the solution is not more restraint. It is removing the trigger that keeps insulin elevated. When carbs drop, insulin drops, and when insulin drops, fat burning resumes, not slowly, not symbolically, but measurably, with increased fatty acid oxidation, higher resting energy expenditure, and improved blood sugar stability documented across multiple clinical trials. This is why ketosis begins not with motivation, not with supplements, not with extreme workouts, but with a decisive reduction in carbohydrates. Because until insulin is lowered, every other effort is fighting upstream against human physiology. The moment insulin steps aside, the body does what it was designed to do: access stored energy, stabilize hunger, sharpen focus, and restore a metabolic rhythm that modern food has silenced. And that is why the first and most critical step into ketosis is not willpower, but biology finally being allowed to speak. For most of human history, eating all day was impossible. And that single fact shaped the entire design of the human body, because long before calories were counted or diets were named, fasting was not a choice. It was a biological rhythm, and your metabolism still remembers it. Every time you eat, insulin rises, and every time insulin rises, fat burning shuts off. But what modern life has done is remove the pause, the silence, the metabolic breathing space that tells the body it is safe to burn stored energy. When food arrives from morning to night, insulin never fully falls, and without that drop, ketosis cannot begin, no matter how clean the diet looks. This is why fasting is not extreme. It is corrective, because it restores the missing signal that modern eating erased. Scientific studies show that within 12 to 24 hours of not eating, liver glycogen is depleted. And once that sugar reserve is gone, the body must switch fuels or fail, and it always chooses survival. At that moment, insulin drops to baseline, sometimes lower than it has been in years, and fat cells finally receive the message they have been waiting for: to open and release energy. This is not theory, it is measurable physiology, confirmed by blood markers showing rapid rises in free fatty acids and ketones during fasting, even in individuals who struggled for years to lose weight through calorie restriction alone. What makes fasting uniquely powerful is that it accelerates ketosis without adding stress to the system. Because instead of forcing the body to burn fat while insulin is still high, it removes the hormonal blockade entirely. Research comparing low-carb diets with and without fasting consistently shows faster ketone production, improved insulin sensitivity, and deeper metabolic shifts when fasting is included, because time without food does something food alone cannot. It gives insulin time to fall and stay low long enough for the switch to flip. The liver, once freed from processing incoming glucose, turns inward and begins converting fat into ketones, a fuel that produces more energy per unit of oxygen than glucose, a fact that may explain why the brain becomes clearer and focus sharpens during ketosis. Neurological studies show that ketones reduce oxidative stress and stabilize neuronal firing, which is why fasting has been explored for epilepsy, neurodegenerative diseases, and traumatic brain injury long before it was ever associated with weight loss. Hunger itself changes under fasting, not by force, but by chemistry. As ghrelin, the hunger hormone, follows circadian patterns and actually decreases after the first fasting window, a finding that surprises people who expect hunger to grow endlessly without food. This is why many report that the second day of fasting feels easier than the first, because the body has shifted from demanding sugar to supplying fat-derived fuel. One of the most shocking findings in fasting research is that resting metabolic rate does not drop in short-term fasts. It often rises, driven by increases in norepinephrine, meaning the body becomes more alert, not slower, contradicting decades of fear-based nutrition advice. Fasting also triggers autophagy, a cellular recycling process that removes damaged proteins and dysfunctional mitochondria, a mechanism so fundamental that its discovery earned a Nobel Prize. And this cleanup process becomes active precisely when insulin is low and nutrients are absent. This means fasting is not just about entering ketosis faster, it is about repairing the system that burns fat in the first place. In people with insulin resistance, fasting has been shown to rapidly improve insulin signaling, sometimes within weeks, because insulin receptors finally get relief from constant stimulation, restoring sensitivity that years of frequent eating destroyed. Modern eating patterns often involve 6 or more insulin spikes per day, a level of hormonal stress never seen in ancestral populations, and fasting corrects this by compressing eating into defined windows, allowing insulin to rise and fall as it was designed to do. Intermittent fasting, such as a 16-hour fast, has been shown to increase fat oxidation even when calories are matched, proving once again that timing matters as much as quantity. Longer fasts push ketosis deeper, not because of deprivation, but because the body fully commits to fat as fuel, and studies show ketone levels during fasting can rise to levels associated with therapeutic benefits without causing muscle loss when protein intake is adequate during eating windows. The fear that fasting wastes muscle is largely unfounded in short-term fasts, as growth hormone increases dramatically during fasting, sometimes by fivefold, preserving lean tissue while fat is mobilized. This hormonal environment is uniquely suited for ketosis because growth hormone supports fat breakdown while insulin remains low, a combination impossible to achieve through constant eating. Perhaps most compelling is the psychological shift that occurs, because fasting breaks the cycle of constant hunger, teaching the brain that energy is abundant even when food is absent, a realization that rewires the relationship with eating at a deep level. When ketosis arrives through fasting, it feels different, not forced, not fragile, but stable, because the body reached it through its own internal logic. Blood sugar stabilizes, inflammation markers decrease, and metabolic flexibility returns, a state strongly associated with reduced risk of chronic disease. In a world where food is always available, fasting may be the most radical health intervention, not because it is new, but because it is ancient, and because it restores the missing half of metabolism, the part that only activates when we stop eating. Ketosis is not just about what you eat, it is about when you don't. And fasting accelerates this shift because it removes the final barrier, constant insulin. When the body is given uninterrupted time without food, it remembers what to do: burn fat, make ketones, protect the brain, and survive. And that is why fasting does not create ketosis, it reveals it, proving that the fastest path into fat burning was never found in food at all, but in the space between meals where biology finally takes over. For years, people were told that fat was the enemy, that eating fat would make you fat, clog your arteries, and shorten your life. Yet this single belief may be one of the most damaging nutritional myths ever created, because fat itself is not the problem, context is. The human body is exquisitely sensitive to signals, and fat sends a very different message depending on whether insulin is high or low, a distinction that modern nutrition advice almost entirely ignores. When carbohydrates are high, insulin is high, and in that state, adding fat becomes a metabolic disaster because insulin instructs the body to store energy, and fat is the easiest energy to store. This is why decades of low fat, high carbohydrate diets coincided with exploding rates of obesity and diabetes. Not because people ate too much fat, but because they ate fat in the presence of constant insulin stimulation. Scientific studies have shown that insulin increases the activity of lipoprotein lipase in fat tissue, an enzyme that pulls fat out of the bloodstream and locks it into fat cells, meaning when insulin is elevated, dietary fat is chemically directed into storage, not burned. This is the shocking truth behind why fat plus carbs is the most fattening combination known to human metabolism, a pairing that dominates ultra-processed foods and keeps people trapped in a cycle of hunger and weight gain. But when carbohydrates are removed and insulin drops, fat transforms from a storage problem into a metabolic solution because in a low insulin environment, fat no longer gets locked away, it becomes fuel. This is not philosophical, it is measurable, as studies using indirect calorimetry show that fat oxidation increases dramatically when insulin is low, even when total calorie intake remains the same. In this state, dietary fat serves a completely different purpose, providing stable energy, supporting hormone production, and teaching the body how to rely on fat instead of sugar. Ketosis depends on this shift because once insulin is suppressed, fat becomes the raw material for ketones, and the liver begins converting fatty acids into beta hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, fuels that the brain can use efficiently even when glucose is scarce. Research shows that ketones produce more energy per unit of oxygen than glucose, which may explain why mental clarity and endurance often improve once fat adaptation occurs. But this only happens when fat is added at the right time, after carbohydrates are low enough to remove insulin's blocking effect. This is where many people fail, adding fat too early, before insulin has fallen, and then wondering why ketosis never arrives. The body does not respond to labels like keto or healthy fat. It responds to hormones, and insulin always has the final say. Once carbs are sufficiently reduced, fat becomes protective, not harmful, because it does not spike insulin and therefore does not interrupt fat burning. Clinical trials consistently show that diets higher in fat but low in carbohydrates improve triglycerides, raise HDL cholesterol, and reduce markers of insulin resistance, outcomes that contradict decades of fat-phobic messaging. The type of fat matters as well because fats that humans have consumed for thousands of years behave differently in the body than industrial seed oils introduced only in the last century. Olive oil, butter, ghee, coconut oil, and fats from whole foods are structurally stable and less prone to oxidation, while many refined vegetable oils oxidize easily, generating inflammatory byproducts that have been linked to metabolic dysfunction in both animal and human studies. When fat is used correctly, it becomes a tool for metabolic training, helping the body adapt to burning fat efficiently, a state known as fat adaptation, which is distinct from simply being in ketosis. Fat adaptation means mitochondria increase their capacity to use fatty acids. Enzymes involved in beta oxidation become more active, and the body no longer panics when glucose is unavailable. This adaptation takes time, but dietary fat plays a crucial role in supporting it, preventing excessive hunger and energy crashes during the transition away from sugar dependence. One of the most misunderstood ideas is the belief that more fat automatically means deeper ketosis, when in reality, excess dietary fat can slow fat loss if it exceeds the body's energy needs, even in ketosis. Ketosis is about hormonal permission, not unlimited intake. And once insulin is low, the body will burn either dietary fat or stored fat depending on availability. This is why fat should be used as a lever, not a crutch, enough to support energy and satiety, but not so much that the body never needs to tap into its own reserves. Studies show that people in ketosis often experience spontaneous calorie reduction, not because they are trying, but because fat and ketones suppress appetite hormones and stabilize blood sugar, making overeating biologically unlikely. Fat also plays a critical role in nutrient absorption, as vitamins A, D, E, and K require fat to be absorbed, meaning low-fat diets can quietly create deficiencies that impair immune function, bone health, and hormone balance. From an evolutionary perspective, fat was the signal of survival, the fuel that allowed humans to endure winters, migrations, and food scarcity, while constant carbohydrate availability is a recent anomaly. When insulin is low and fat intake is appropriate, inflammation markers such as CRP often decrease and insulin sensitivity improves, outcomes repeatedly observed in low-carb, higher-fat interventions. The tragedy is that fat was blamed for the damage caused by sugar and refined carbohydrates, leading entire generations to fear the very nutrient that could have stabilized their metabolism. Used at the wrong time, fat is storage, but used at the right time, fat is freedom. Ketosis thrives when fat is added after carbs are removed, because only then does fat reinforce the metabolic state instead of fighting it. The body does not need fat to enter ketosis, but it needs fat to sustain it without stress, muscle loss, or constant hunger. When this balance is respected, ketosis becomes sustainable, not extreme, and fat becomes what it always was meant to be: a clean, stable, ancient fuel that works in harmony with human biology instead of against it. If you found this helpful, support your health journey by learning more, and I'll see you in the next video.